Jesus freak here. I should probably clear the air as to who I am, what my point is. On YouTube. My name has come out in the open here a bit. It's Steve Nicholas. I mostly grew up in foster homes, but for a short period of about 5.5 years, I was actually raised by family. Note I said family, not parents, because it wasn't. You see, my grandmother was a bit of a narcissistic control freak. And when, as you do, you grow up in the sticks. Time runs slower. So it may have been the 1980s. We weren't running on 1980s morality. We were running on like 1950s, early 1960s morality. Maybe even earlier. And since I was born out of wedlock, that used to be a much bigger deal. I was basically the red-headed stepchild, in a very literal sense. Now, my grandmother and one of my uncles were the ones who actually raised me during that period. Both my uncles on my dad's side of the family. I don't know anything about my mom's side of the family. Both my uncles on my dad's side of the family were, at the time, basically what you'd consider substitute preachers. It's a quirk of our faith tradition as United Methodists that we tend to have people start out as sort of substitute ministers while they're learning how to become proper ministers, and eventually they get ordained and become ministers. So I was kinda sorta what you'd call a PK, preacher's kid. Now, I've mentioned I come from the United Methodist tradition, and the United Methodist Church is pretty much the dead center. Perhaps even with emphasis on dead. You're either more liberal than the United Methodists, in which case you're generally considered a mainline church, or you're more conservative than the United Methodists, in which case you're generally considered an evangelical church. The United Methodist Church sits right on the line. I was raised in the more conservative part of the United Methodist Church. I attend a United Methodist congregation, and it's one of the more liberal ones. But with that being said, the pastor at my current church emphasizes and teaches out of the Bible, which is a lot more than a lot of other pastors I've listened to. And something you definitely don't see enough of in the mainline churches. Now, I come from this faith tradition, but I don't agree with it 100%. So I'm basically a free thinker. I consider myself United Methodist. That is my faith tradition, and I'm sticking with it. But I am also, in a sense, evangelical, restorationist, in the sense that I want to bring the Methodists back to their roots. The Methodists were the original evangelicals back in the 1750s, 1760s. And some Methodist groups still are evangelical. One could consider me Baptist with a little b. Because unlike most, I say most because my family would generally agree with me, unlike most Methodists, I believe in believers only immersion baptism. Now I go further and say it should be for adults only. Because some Baptist churches baptize a 7-year-old. I say it should be 21 and older only. I admit, I've come up with a few rather unusual interpretations. When I say this is what I believe, this is my point of reference. That's all. Now, people are going to say, you weren't really saved if you weren't saved on a King James. I wasn't saved on a King James. Now, I don't even use the word saved. Since I use the word salvation more in the sense an evangelical is going to say sanctification. But if I were going to use, the evangelical vocabulary, what Bible were you saved with? New Revised Standard. That was a standard in our church for years. They even published editions of it with our church's logo, the cross and split flame. And it's funny. I grew up principally on the RSV Revised Standard Version, NRSV New Revised Standard Version, and the New International Version. Though most of the Bibles I owned as a kid, most of the Bibles my family bought me were King James. In fact, almost all of them, all the ones I got from my family were Nelson. So I'm put in a weird situation. I was raised both on the King James and other translations. And you wouldn't think that someone like me would actually prefer the King James. Well, in a way, I don't. If you really wanted to pump me for what version I prefer, it's the RSV. But for practical reasons, I say I think we should standardize in the church on the King James. And I've put my money where my mouth is. Most of the time, probably about 99% of my videos, if I'm reading from the Bible, I'm reading from the King James. Even though I have my own translation of the New Testament, if I'm reading the Bible, it's almost always going to be the King James. The Bibles I take to church, because I rotate through them, they're all King James. Now, another thing that probably affects my beliefs is the fact that growing up, I faced a fair bit of abuse. Most of this, at the time even it would have been considered abuse, but by the standards of the time period that, I mentioned that the morality being used by my family wasn't that of the 80s. It was that of the 50s and 60s. And back then, it wouldn't have been considered abuse. It would have been considered normal discipline. And I'll admit, a lot of people went through that and came out fine. When there's already something wrong in your head, and when you're suffering from culture shock because you're not used to that kind of discipline, you came from a different style of upbringing before that. And people think that your neurodiversity, in my case autism, is just you being a troublemaker, you being an ass, you being stubborn. Yeah, it can leave scars. I went through pretty rough times in my life. Some will say, what doesn't kill you just makes you stronger. I tend to think Joker's line from The Dark Knight might be a bit more on point. What don't kill you just makes you stranger. And I probably do come across to you guys as strange. I'm certainly different. And I felt, I guess, that YouTube needed a voice that was different than every other vocal Christian YouTuber out there. And I guess that's what I was hoping to do. Maybe I've succeeded, maybe I've failed. I seem to have some interest from other people out there. I hope that means I'm succeeding. But in the end, no. Ain't my call. Jesus freak out.